My name is John Waldman. I'm a professor of biology and a conservation biologist at Queens College, New York, and my project was titled Running Silver. My project is timely because it concerns a serious and I think overlooked conservation biology issue in this country, the near decimation of East Coast diatomous fish runs. These are species like sturgeon and salmon and shad and eels that once ran in rivers along the East Coast in countless numbers and are now down to levels, in some cases, of only 2 or 3% of what they were at their peak. So the first part of my Running Silver project is a book that I'm titling Running Silver to Ghost Fishes. And running silver is a metaphor for the old days, the good old days, when these fish ran in such incredible numbers that the water was said to literally run silver with their bodies. In fact, there are these wonderful quotes from early Europeans about what they saw in this country, and they were simply blown away by the incredible abundances that they were not used to, coming from a continent that had been heavily fished and had had environmental issues for centuries. And there were accounts of people walking dry shod across the backs of the fish. I mean, it's embellished, but it just gives you a sense of the incredible numbers they saw. So that's a metaphor for the early days, and I'm covering the arc of history in calling the other half of the title Ghost Fishes. Ghost Fishes is another metaphor for a concept in conservation biology these days in which there are species that are so reduced or even extirpated that they function as ghosts in the ecology of the area that they once played an important role in. So this is the arc of history that I'm tracing in this book, and the reasons why we've had this incredible decline of these fishes has to do with a series of mismanagement effects over the course of time since the Europeans colonized this country. The principal one being the creation of many, many dams that block the spawning runs of these fish. These fish have a need to get far inland in order to deposit their eggs and to complete their life cycles, which include these really majestic migrations, this wonderful grand life history where they're born uprivers, mature in estuaries, go out to sea, spend their life at sea before they come back to spawn again. It's a very small component of the world's fishes, only less than 1% have this kind of life history, but they are some of the most important fish to people in terms of food and sport. Things like salmon and shad and sturgeon have tremendously important societal histories. So dams are number one on my list of major perturbations to the ecology of these fish, but other factors that have played a role, including overfishing, the sheer just removal of too many fish in many cases that have driven populations to very low numbers, and pollution is the third one in terms of what I would call the mantra of the big three that has hurt the habitats of these fish. But in more recent years, alien species have been seen as a major contributor to the declines. Species that either compete with or actually consume the young of these fish, or that just change the ecologies of the system. We're sitting here not far from the Hudson River, which was invaded by zebra mussels in the early 90s, and which has changed the nature of the system from the top down. It's a whole different system because of this one mistake of allowing these creatures into the system. And that's happened in many different ways in rivers across the country and along the entire East Coast. And then climate change is having a large effect on these fish too. We're seeing ranges shift, and we're seeing shifts in the ecology and the timing of the migrations because of climate change. So these populations have experienced enormous declines, and I'm looking at them holistically, and I think that it's very much an effort to re-inspire people caring more about these fish. A difference between my work and other pieces of work on these fish is that I'm looking at the entire suite of these fish comprehensively. There have been these wonderful books like John McPhee's book on shad called The Founding Fish, or James Prosek's book on eels called The Most Mysterious Fish in the Sea. But I'm looking at a dozen or so species holistically and looking at the commonalities and the differences among them. And they share many commonalities in terms of having experienced these effects. But I'm also looking at societal perceptions of these fish and their status. One of the major paradigms in conservation biology these days is this notion of shifting baselines. The idea that as resource managers come into a new situation, they will attempt to hold the line on losses of the creatures they're managing. And quite often there's slippage because of general pressures from how we live today. And what happens over time is that there's a ratcheting effect where the population decline further, and managers try to hold the line, but over the course of generations of managers, you get this major slippage. And this was a term, shifting baselines, proposed by Daniel Pauly, and it's had great repercussions throughout the management world of the seas. But I think he was right on in terms of finding that there was an association between the perceptions of managers and this long-term decline. But I think that there's more to shifting baselines, and that's the idea that the public also manages to forget these species. And you have something called generational amnesia occurring, where not only do the managers not succeed in having these species recover, but the society that produces these managers forgets about them, and you get this lack of interest in these species over time, so that if I compare the situation on the West Coast with Pacific salmon there have been declining in very recent years. And because of that, there's a sense of urgency about them. There's a feeling that this is a crisis, that we're losing our salmon. We lost our salmon and our shad and our sturgeon here in terms of really meaningful numbers more than a century ago. And because of that, there is no urgency. So what I'm trying to do with this book is not only spur the managers on, but also reconnect to the public and say, hey people, you're missing something that was spectacular, that was part of our natural heritage, which is now gone. You know, these were actual nature spectacles. People could go to a river and watch rivers run silver with these bodies of these fish, and nowadays you're lucky if in some situations if you see any fish at all. There are visitor centers for anadromous fish on the East Coast that don't see a single anadromous fish in the spring, and yet they tout the wonders of you know, the management of the rivers. So there's a real disconnect, and I'm hoping to just create some tailwind behind these restoration efforts in this project. The DeBlasio Residency was wonderful in a couple of regards. One was that I had a daily refuge in which I could write for hours and hours, totally uninterrupted, and that is just a marvelous experience to have in today's world as an academic. And then I was able to, over the course of the day, mingle with scholars from other disciplines from all over the world. And we were all so different from each other, and yet I think equally passionate in our work, that I found that very inspirational. But beyond that, in discussions with people who were not in my area whatsoever, it occurred to me that I really should focus more on the historical and societal aspects, in particular the notion of where a species is in its trajectory of decline, and also its sense of charisma. You know, there are some species we don't care about very much because they're noxious or they're small, but there are other species like panda bears or salmon or sturgeon that have great charisma. But where they stand in terms of their restoration efforts depends partly on how recently they've declined. And a really good example of this is the eastern oyster, and I've been involved with oyster restoration efforts and oyster study around New York Harbor. If you look at the eastern oyster, in the Carolinas, where they have lots of oysters, it's simply a part of daily life. People go out and they catch oysters and they eat them, and they don't cost very much, and they have oyster festivals. If you go to Chesapeake Bay, they've declined dramatically, but they still have them. So there's a sense, almost a prosaic sense of, hey, we're losing our oysters, we have to bring them back. And it's a task, but it's not anything more than that. In the case of New York Harbor, we lost our oysters really well over a century ago, and yet it's recent enough, especially with books that have come out about oysters in New York Harbor, that there's a sense of romance about restoring something that's totally gone. And yet if we wait too long, we forget that too. So there's a sweet spot of history, I think, when it comes to restoring these charismatic creatures, and I'm hoping that we haven't gone too far past the state for these East Coast migratory fish.